African Business Traditions in Early America, presented by Nathaniel Roma. So first, you can't really understand the contributions of enslaved Africans in the New World without understanding the methods and values of the African economy, because of these are the same methods and values that enslaved Africans took with them into the New World. Another important factor in the economic activity of enslaved Africans um, was the transatlantic slave trade itself. And so I look at what roles Africans played and the effects on Africa, but also, and very importantly, which ethnicities were sought after for specific trades in the Americas. I then go into the original Black-owned businesses and what they looked like and how they made money and why they did what they did, why they decided to take on these endeavors. And then I go into what more and what culture carried over, the economic impact and culture impact and influence of Black businesses, even today. So first, the levels of trade. So the most basic level of trade were the markets, and William Bosman has a firsthand account from the late 17th century, and he says the streets are prodigious and long and broad, in which continual markets are kept. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a market today, a recent market, that looks a lot like how he described the markets back then. Those markets would have been the items there would have been primarily results of surplus production. Um, this was usually done at the household level, where women would work their land and produce crops that they would use for themselves, and then whatever they had left over, they would go and sell at these markets. Um, the next level of trade were our merchants, which this was a more male-dominated profession, and they were involved at all levels of trade, from uh, these market levels to intra-regional trade to even international trade. And women were involved here, of course, usually, um, very rarely at an international level, usually as wholesalers, or at a more regional level. And the next level would be nations. Um, what would, what was very common was to be a middleman, um, and essentially they would collect the tax, um, from if you were going through their nation, they would collect the tax. These the nations that dominated the slave trade at the time. And you can't talk about the economy without talking about taxes, which were always a tribute to the king. And he would permit certain individuals to collect taxes and they would take a profit. But taxes, even back then, people hated taxes. And tax evasion was very common, and people would often brag about how much they were able to get off of their taxes by lying about how much they made. So next is important to understand the economic values that African civilizations had. So first to talk about the organizations that existed, they were often based off of kinship. So you would, join the organizations of your family, um, and they would be broad. So it wouldn't just be of course, your immediate family. It'd be your extended family and your extended family that would be within these groups. Um, and so they would have trade organizations, and two very dominant ones were the Denkira and the Asante. And the Denkira primarily traded in gold and were actually the primary traders of gold. Um, and the Asante were primarily traded in slaves and guns. But eventually the Asante were able to conquer the Denkira and uh, sold them into slavery, actually. Craft guilds were another important organization, and they were often related to the state, but they would control prices so that to ensure fair trade, but it essentially provided a monopoly so that everybody could trade fairly, and people weren't being cut, uh, their prices weren't being cut. And another form of organization would be community cooperatives, which were just organizations that were um, organized by the community that would help in large, like often labor undertakings. So if they had to like clear a field or build a large building, they would be involved in that. And the community, of course, is extremely important, is extremely valuable. It, yeah, extremely valuable. Mutual aid is evidence of this. They had mutual aid they would give to people who um could not work for whatever reason, if they were sick or if they were elderly. And they had a huge stigma of poverty, but it went beyond that because it wasn't just a stigma. Um, they actually lifted people out of poverty, and you can find many firsthand accounts of Europeans being so surprised that they don't see anybody begging on the street. And that's because they had such a uh, disdain for poverty, that they wouldn't allow their brother to suffer. And they also had an ideal of communal land. And this wasn't everywhere, but it was certainly a prevalent idea, um, that nobody really owned the land and it belonged to the community. And if you wanted to profit off of your land, you could get permission to do that, but it didn't belong to you. So now the transatlantic slave trade. So in Africa, to start, Africans dealt slaves centuries before Europeans arrived. Between the years 650 and 1850, there were over 7 million people traded just from West Africa across the Sahara into the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. In this trans-Saharan slave trade provided a basis, a foundation for uh, the transatlantic slave trade once the Europeans arrived. And as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, Africa lost 75 million people, West Africa specifically. Um, so as you can guess, the economy can't really recover from that. It's detrimental, and the effects are long lasting. Um, and then we can go to now in the Americas. Most slaves went to South America, South America and the Caribbean. The first slaves arrived in Hispaniola in the late 1400s, I believe. But the first slaves in the what is now the United States arrived in 1619. Um, but yeah, African contributions drove the economy, not just in North America, of course, but wherever they were, whether it was just unskilled labor or if it was actually skilled work. Um, and actually, specific tribes were sought for their skills, specifically those from the Gold Coast, were wanted because they had a very strong work ethic, and they were regarded as intelligent. And Senegambians were sought after for their equestrian ability and their cattle raising ability. And they were regarded actually as the first cowboys. The first cowboys were African slaves who had know-how in these areas of raising horses and raising cattle. So African businesses in America. So first to start, enslaved Africans, provision grounds were common, right? They took this idea that they had from in Africa in their communities where they would be given permission to work land, and they applied that to uh, their lives as slaves, and they would get land from their owners that they could work and turn a profit from. And they would often sell these items to their owners, or sometimes they would go to markets, and they had to create their own markets um, where they would sell their items. Um, one interesting fact is that slaves' property was more respected than them. So oftentimes, um, when a slave owner would try to take their slaves' land after they passed, um, they were thwarted by the court system, which I found very surprising. One interesting example of the um, business acumen of enslaved Africans is that of Francis Payne. He was able to sign a contract with his owner that gave him managerial power over this plot that his owner gave to him, and he was able to work uh, and make enough, produce enough tobacco and make enough money that he was able to eventually get his family free. Interestingly enough, actually, after purchasing um, indentured servants to help him work his land.